It's titled America Chose Wealth Over Well-Being, how billionaires rewrote the American dream. And, while other nations offer universal benefits, we double down on having billionaires. Yeah. Yesterday, Congress certified the Electoral Count vote, making a billionaire president again, starting after he's sworn in on January 20th. Yep, we chose a billionaire again, after other billionaires spent billions to convince us to make that choice. So as you're, listening to my voice right this moment, billionaires from America and around the world are making a pilgrimage to Mar-a-Lago to kiss and him, million envelopes with $1 million checks in them, which represent for most of them, at most, a few minutes or a few hours of income for them or their companies. Meanwhile, our billionaire president is packing his cabinet with billionaires, the most in the history of the world, something that's being celebrated over on billionaire-owned Fox News and billionaire-owned 8 radio networks, as well as the billionaire-owned Washington Post, the billionaire-owned LA Times, and the roughly half of American local newspapers that are owned by billionaire hedge funds. Here's the bottom line. Other developed countries enjoy benefits like free health care and college, modern mass transit, affordable housing, food, and drugs. They also have inexpensive internet and phone service without companies listening in and selling their information, schools that don't even need to mention school shooters, and streets and parks filled with pedestrians and children instead of tents for the homeless. Additionally, they benefit from renewable electricity that gets cheaper every year while cleaning their environment. So that's what other countries. Here, we have the world's largest collection of billionaires. Seriously, that's our distinction. And most Americans probably don't realize it, but this was a choice we made in 1980. Now, there's a little history here. We were battered badly in 1973, the tail end of the Nixon administration, when we took Israel's side in the I believe it was the 6-Day War, and the Arab nations punished us by cutting off our oil supplies. This produced an explosion of inflation here in the United States and led to basically an economic crash, and threw us into about a 15-year long period of what was then referred to as stagflation, which was high unemployment combined with high inflation. And Nixon couldn't deal with it, right? His alternate days for the gas pumps, odd, even days, depending on your license plate number, just pissed off people. It didn't work. Jerry Ford couldn't handle it. He had his whip inflation now buttons, the big buttons that said WIN, like we were all supposed to wear them. And yes, we're going to whip inflation. Yeah, that was pathetic. It kind of guaranteed that he'd become a one-term president. And Jimmy Carter made some good progress. He actually got inflation down quite substantially. He also put together the National Solar Bank, which was going to provide 20% of our nation's power by the year 2000, put solar panels on the White House. But Reagan's campaign cut a deal with the Ayatollahs in Iran to hold the hostages, and that was the end of Jimmy Carter's presidency. Reagan became president in 1981. Inflation was still a problem. Part of it was an echo of the 1973 oil embargo, but also in 79, when the Iranian Revolution happened, that disrupted oil supplies to the United States and around the world. So there was a second oil shock that produced another problem that, again, hurt Jimmy Carter in 79. So by that time, by 1980, by that election, I mean, we'd had 15 years, basically, 17 years, 18 years, 17 years of stagflation, of inflation and high unemployment and an economy that just didn't seem to be working. And it wasn't the fault of the New Deal. It was because we were so dependent on oil, and there had been these two major oil shocks, the first in 73 with the Arab oil embargo and the second in 79 with the Iranian Revolution. But, along came Reagan. He was a very talented actor. I mean, even more talented than Donald Trump, although Trump has been, NBC spent millions training Donald Trump to perform for the television cameras, and he's made good use of that. But Reagan was even better. And Reagan convinced us that he had the solution to the problem. Now, of course, the solution to the problem was time, right? Just like we're seeing right now. When you have a shock, like the COVID shock, or the Arab oil embargo shock, or the Iranian Revolution oil shock, when you have an economic shock like that, it takes a decade or so to work your way out of it. But Reagan, knowing that, better times would be coming, basically said, oh, we've got the solution. It's these magical things, supply-side economics, the Laffer curve, and trickle down. And George Herbert Walker Bush called this voodoo economics at first, and then he became, vice president, and suddenly he was a true believer. And, Reagan took office, and we, I didn't believe him, but a lot of Americans did. And he turned our economy inside out. He massively cut taxes on the country's 13 billionaires. Yes, there were 13 billionaires then. Repeatedly raised taxes on millions of working class people, cut and taxed Social Security, stopped enforcement of our anti-monopoly laws, gutted federal funds for education, killed off 2/3 of the country's unions, and by negotiating the GATT and NAFTA agreements, began the process of offshoring over 60,000 factories, millions of jobs. Now, Reagan never got inflation below 4%, and he tripled the national debt from $800 million to about $2.2 billion. But throwing around a couple $1 trillion in borrowed money made the economy look good, and that's how we got the billionaires. Because Reagan, cut taxes so radically. In 1980, the year of the election, the richest man in America was a guy by the name of Daniel Ludwig, tycoon, and he was worth $2 billion. Today, he wouldn't even make the Forbes 500 list. And he lived a low-key life, and like most wealthy men of that era, he did not participate, in any significant way in politics. But Reagan's changes in the tax code, dropping the top income tax rate on multi-million-dollar incomes from 74% down to 25%, and then raising it up to 28%. That caused an explosion in the number of billionaires. By 1990, there were 99 billionaires in America. Today, there's over 800 of them. That's a 50-fold increase in billionaires in just 4 decades. And then the billionaires, not content with just being rich, decided to take over our politics. They set up institutions to seize control of the independent judiciary. 5 corrupt Republicans on the Supreme Court returned the favor with Citizens United, saying, okay, billionaires, you can now buy politicians. And so they went out and bought the entire Republican Party and a good-sized handful of Democrats. They created media empires, think tanks, policy centers. They write their own legislation and hand it off to Republicans who then introduce it. They purchased, like I said, the entire RNC. Total spending on federal elections, President, House, and Senate, in 1980 was $92 million. It was $103 million in 84. It was $324 million in 1988. Wasn't that quaint? In this last election, we know of $7 billion that was spent, including $250 million by Elon Musk just to put Trump in office. And that doesn't count the dark money, which is probably several more $1 billion. And we don't talk about this in our media because our media is owned by billionaires too. Now, maybe one day America will join the other 37 wealthy OECD countries in offering, to average and low-income people nearly free college and health care, removing guns from our streets and our schools, housing the homeless, building modern mass transit. Maybe our middle class will again become socially and economically mobile. We'll rid ourselves of $2 trillion in student debt. Joe Biden tried to do that. Republicans sued to the Supreme Court and stopped him. And maybe someday we'll never again be the only developed country in the world where 500,000 families lose everything, to have to declare bankruptcy because somebody in the family got sick. But for at least the next 4 years, we have to content ourselves with the knowledge that we have more billionaires than any other country in the world, and that they now run our government. The top 1% own 40.5% of our nation's entire wealth. As the Forbes headline says, quote, the 3 richest Americans hold more wealth than the bottom 50% of the country. Yep, sure enough. We're number 1. And for at least the next 4 years, Donald Trump and the Republican Party promise to do everything they can to keep it that way.